Okay, guys, welcome back. We have the last speaker on the Queen stage tonight, and it's Jemima. Say hello.
Hi,
Hi.
everyone.
So, Jemima is a self taught front end developer and school taught systems engineer from Nigeria. She currently works at Telesoftas, which is a software company based in Lithuania. I assume you don't live in Lithuania.
I do actually. Well, I'm not there right now, but I do live in Lithuania.
Oh, that is nice. And how do you like it? This is a normal question. Yes. How is the Cepeline?
It's you're not trying to like fish for compliments on your country. Yeah, I get it. It's
Nah, not really. Nah.
nice. And it's quiet and it's cold and it's
It
a
is
lovely,
cold.
quiet, peaceful place.
It
Big
is
fan.
cold. Yeah. We have to sit with those pretty t-shirts branded and stuff, but it is cold, let's be honest. So yeah, she is also a huge nerd. So hello, I will have questions about that if we won't have any questions from the audience. And slightly obsessed with cats. I don't know what does it mean to be slightly obsessed. Do you have like
Like a
9 cats?
healthy amount, five.
5. That
I
is
had
slightly.
5 cats, but now I've moved past that.
That is
Hence,
slightly.
slight obsession. See?
Okay, so okay, I won't interrupt you for anymore, and the stage is yours, please.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. My name is Jemima Abu, and today I'm going to be talking to you about building accessible components in React, which I feel is a very apt topic because we are at build stuff, so we should learn how to build stuff accessibly. I'd like to apologize in advance because I have like 4 more puns based around build stuff, so bear with me. So the lovely introduction from earlier, I am a self-taught from school taught systems engineer from Lagos, Nigeria. I'm currently working at Telesoftas in Kaunas, Lithuania. And if you want to follow me online anywhere, you can find me at Jemima Abu. So you can just like send me a message or hit me up and ask me questions about anything. I love interacting with strangers over the internet because that is what it should be for. So let's get right into it. The topic of this presentation is building accessible components in React. But before we get into that, we need to understand what is accessibility and why is it important? Why do we need to care about building accessible things? Simply put, accessibility means that everyone can use your product regardless of whatever. Now, when we say whatever, you could be thinking things like, oh, okay, so visually impaired people, or people who have hearing impairment, or people who rely on keyboards to navigate things. But it could also be people who have slow internet connection, or people who are driving and cannot, scroll the website with their hands, or people who are standing under direct sunlight, or people who are old, or people who are slow, people who have attention deficit disorder. I always have such a problem pronouncing that thing. So the point is, whenever you're creating things, you need to keep in mind that people could be using your product. I need to build these things so that everyone can use it. So the simple reason why I think accessibility is important, especially when it comes to web development, is if you're building a site that people can't use, then who are you building it for? It makes sense that you're building your sites for people to use them. But then if you build your sites in a way that certain people can't use them, then this is you alienating a group of people, and this is meaning that your site is kind of useless to those people. So think about it. When I was in university, I lived with a bunch of visually impaired people for a semester, and then sometimes I would help them have to go through their phone, and that is when I realized how annoying some websites are built because they did not take into account accessibility needs of their users. So, for example, if you set your accessibility features on your Samsung, it does this thing where you can't just scroll with one hand, you have to scroll with 2 fingers. And then if you want to tap a link, you have to double tap. So, there are some sites that I'd go to and I'd be trying to scroll with 2 fingers, but these sites have done this annoying, what is it, like fast scrolling thing. So, like before I can't even like get it to scroll how I want to because these sites are taking away the scrolling ability for me. Or there are some sites that didn't allow zooming in features. So some sites would prevent you from zooming in. And then for times when I'm trying to click a particular button or a link and it's too tiny to double tap and I have to zoom in, wouldn't be able to do that. So it was during that whole semester that I kind of learned that it's very important to build sites in a way that everyone can use them because it's really annoying when you can't use a site. So yeah. And now this is a picture of Beyonce saying, we can make components accessible. And I didn't just use this picture because of Beyonce, but also to reiterate a point, which is that accessibility is a legal issue. Sometime in January, either 2018 or 2019, Beyonce's agency, Parkwood Entertainment, was sued over website inaccessibility. Her website wasn't accessible, and a visually impaired lady was trying to purchase tickets from her website, and she wasn't able to do that. In the snippet here, it says the complaint lists further issues, including the lack of accessible drop-down menus and navigation links, and the inability to navigate using a keyboard instead of a mouse. So Beyonce's agency was sued, and they had to go settle in court. So there are legal consequences to not having accessible websites. This is especially important even in the EU. I think there was a 2019 EU Web Directive that instructs companies with like public sector companies or companies such as e-commerce companies that are trying to provide the service people to have accessible websites according to the WCAG guidelines. So these are important because if you don't have them, then you're opening yourself up to like lawsuits and stuff because technically you're breaking the law. So, building sites so that everyone can use them, but also being on the right side of the law. Making sure your site's accessible is also really good for business cases, but I don't really talk about that here because that's business stuff. So now you know what accessibility is and you know why it's important. So how do we actually build accessible components? A lot of times I hear people ask, okay, so like how would you recommend we get started with building accessible components, or how can I make the components that I'm building currently, or how can I make the website that I'm building currently be accessible? I think for me the easiest way to make your site accessible is to be deliberate about it. Accessibility is something that requires deliberate action. It's not just something that you do haphazardly and be like, all right, we added a feature for screen readers or we included a skip to main menu link, so we're done. No, it's something that you have to go over each time. The same way you would try to make sure that your site is using the latest technology or that it's always being up to date and trying to make sure that your sites are cross-browser compatible. It's the same way you should make sure that your sites are accessible. These are all because cross-browser compatibility, for example, is something that as a front-end developer I find annoying. Like I want to use a grid somewhere, but I can't use grid because it's not supported in some version of Internet Explorer, so I have to end up using Flexbox. So to me, that is inconvenient. But to somebody who is accessing my site using Opera Mini or Internet Explorer, it works for them. So it's the same thing with accessibility. You may think that it's taking you more time to make sure the site is accessible, but if you do it right and you do it at the beginning, it wouldn't take you any more time than it would. Frankly, it would take you less time than it would if you were trying to make it accessible at the end of building your site. So think about it. Another easy way to make sure that your site is accessible is to follow the accessibility principles by the Web Compliance Accessibility. I always mix up that thing. But yeah, there's a Web Accessibility Compliance Guideline, WACG, I think. And the guidelines are simply to make sure that it's perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. So this could apply to things like your content or how your navigation works or how your site complies with extra technologies or how people assimilate the information you're trying to pass across on your site. There are a bunch of different principles and guidelines, and you can just go through them. I included the link here, and we'll be sharing the slides later, so you can always have access to it. And then also, personally, I like using an accessibility checklist. This is basically just a checklist for design. This particular one, it's also a link. It's for designers and developers. It's by, I think, Romeo someone. I can't not remember his last name, but I included the link here so you can check it out. It's a very helpful PDF. It's just like a little like check boxes of things that you can do. So things like making sure your images have alt tags or making sure your videos have captions, making sure you're using semantic elements where you should be. So it's really useful and it's really great if you're trying to, let's say you run a team or you work on a team of developers and you're trying to make sure all of them are keeping to accessibility guidelines compliance. So yeah. Oh, repeated that. So yeah, now we know the stage of building accessibility of making sure your website's accessible. So now let's get to how to build stuff. Accessible React components. That was pun number 2, so I'm almost out. So yeah, building accessible React components. The reason I want to give this talk specifically is because I have given some talks on building on accessibility in JavaScript, accessibility in CSS, HTML accessibility, and then general web accessibility. But then because I work with React specifically, I realized that there are some issues in React that are accessibility issues specific to React and that are not really general issues. So that's why I wanted to give this talk, just to make sure for developers like me who are working with React and you may have some issues that you need ways to like get around or get over and you're not quite sure what the easiest fix is. So this is basically just going to be like little tips and tricks that I recommend for making sure your React components are accessible. And then I include some, if there's time after the end, we could go through a little demo. Problem is, I'm not quite sure how to switch my screen between this one and the demo one, but we'll see how that goes. And then I have some resources and links listed at the end that we could also go through, and it'll be great. Let's get into it. So the first thing and the easiest thing when it comes to web accessibility, the most basic thing you should do is to keep things semantic. HTML is built to be an accessible language by using semantic elements. It's like it's an inbuilt accessibility feature. So you don't even need to like install anything or write any extra code. All you need to do is use the right tags you're supposed to be using. Now, because we work with React or because we're writing React elements, a lot of times you just want to keep your content in a div tag because you know how React is. You cannot just have a component. Every component needs to be wrapped in like a surrounding element. And so sometimes you may be like, okay, fine, I'll just throw the entire component in like a div tag and that's fine. But the catch with that is by the time you start compiling your components and including subcomponents, you're going to end up with a lot of div tags in your entire DOM, and those div tags are very generic elements. So think of it this way. Let's say you have a bunch of cans, or like I don't know what they're called, but I call them cans. Don't have any labels on these cans. Now, if you're somebody who does not rely on labels, for example, you could just open the cans to know what's inside, because you can easily see inside the cans and you know what's inside. But what about people who can't open the cans? People who need these labels to know what's inside. Like imagine if you went to a supermarket and you try to open every can that was on the shelf to know what was inside. That'd be a lot of cans you have to buy. Like the metaphor is getting away from me, but the point is, if you make sure that your elements are semantic, you're making it easier for your users to identify what that element contains. So, for example, here we have div and spans. Div and spans are very generic elements which don't tell screen readers anything about the content of that element. But then when I get specific with it, when I start using elements like main or nav or header or footer or aside or section, this is letting my screen reader know immediately that okay, this is probably the header content. This is the nav bar. So this is something that contains navigation. This is the footer. So it's probably the last thing on the page. This is an aside. So it's probably a sidebar. So semantic tags basically communicate to screen readers the content of a page, and it's helpful because think of it as creating page outlines. So now imagine you had a textbook, and in the textbook they just kind of wrote like the chapters of each page, and then it was easier for you to scroll through. But now if there was this textbook without a table of contents, for example, you would have no idea of knowing what was on each page until you had to start flipping through everything. So think of it that way. People who rely on screen readers need semantic tags to be able to understand the content and the outline of your page. So yeah, another thing is to avoid generic naming. This is really more of like code readability than web accessibility, but I did include that because I found it was useful. So for example, when you have things like here I have my constyled label. This is really good because this is a style component, and I really like style components because they are great ways of generating labels, of generating elements and making sure the elements are semantic, but without having to think of like class names for them, for example. So here I am generating a styled label, and it's just going to return my styled label here. And then I'm also exporting a const impute container. So by the time this thing renders, it's going to return a label with all these style properties I've defined. But luckily, I didn't have to create like a class name for it. I didn't have to create like an external module for it, for example. So it's great. And then speaking of labels, another thing we note is that we need to label accordingly. So in React, sometimes when you're creating forms, it's tempting to not include labels or include, there's this new thing that people are doing now. It's like this form, but it doesn't have labels. What it has is placeholders, and then the placeholder like can zoom up to the top of the form or something like that. So now the problem with placeholders is that once people start writing in your form, those placeholders go away. And for people like me, for example, if I'm filling out a lot of forms and I cannot easily tell what the input of the form is, I'm going to forget what I was filling out. So sometimes you can just have like a name and email form, and then that's easy. But what if you have something that has like name, email, address, phone number, social security number, mother's maiden name, father's maiden name? And if none of these forms have labels and they only have placeholders, I am going to forget what I am filling out. So including labels is very important. And then including labels that are attached to the form elements they are created for is also very important. In React, we do not use for. We don't just have like a for attribute. What we use is HTML for, and that is how you link your label to your input. So how labels that are linked to input works is that if you click on the label, it automatically like focuses you on the input that you're being on the input you're trying to type in. This is very useful for people who use screen readers or people who rely on like double tap or keyboard navigation, because that way you don't necessarily have to be in the input you're typing. The label is also linked to the input, so it's really easy for you to use it straightforward. And then using fragments in place of unnecessary divs. So like I said earlier, a lot of times in React, it's tempting to just throw random divs everywhere and then just like, contain this container here, contain this component there, div it, div it, div it. But the problem with that is that by the time you're rendering these components, you're going to end up with a lot of unnecessary divs. So let's take a look at what we mean by unnecessary divs. So now we have a component here that renders two sub-components. Now, usually in React say that you need to put these now. You can't just return these two. You need to put these in a container element. So now, instead of using a div tag that is not necessary, and when we say not necessary, a div tag that is not necessary means a div tag that does not have any styling purpose or any information purpose, or it does not serve any purpose other than being a container, because in React a lot of times that's what we end up doing. So instead of doing that, you can just use a fragment. So in React, a fragment is an empty opening and closing tag, which when this is rendered on the DOM, it will not actually show up in the DOM. It will just show these two components here, and it won't show the it will just show these two components here, and it will not show the empty tag. So it's actually really useful. You can also use it by, in case you need to passing any attributes to the component, for example, you can just use your react.fragment. It also works for when you're trying to avoid improper nesting. So think of it like you have a table element, or the one I used here is a definition DLDT, and so a definition list, and then the definition term and the definition description. So now let's say you wanted to render this definition term and description here, but then because in React you can't just render them as they are, you need to put them into a div. This would have been an unnecessary div, and that would have meant that your nesting would no longer be accessible, because now you're nesting these terms and descriptions inside divs, and people who are using screen readers, for example, are not going to be able to easily access that list the way you intended them to access it. So that's where React fragments come into play. So React fragments will just render as empty elements and not affecting your nesting at all, which is great. And then this is something that actually applies to TypeScript, but I did include it here because in case you work with TypeScript, something that's very useful. It's using the extend keyword to access native element attributes. So now, for example, sometimes you're trying to build components and you may require a custom component and you need to build like a custom button, for example. So you just create your regular div and then give it an on-click property and you think you're done. But now what about on key press or on focus or on hover? There are a lot of attributes that are native to elements that you may not notice immediately, but you'd probably notice if you're trying to use them the same way you'd be trying to use a native element. So an easy way to extend that, to apply that if you don't have those attributes readily, is to use the extend keyword. So here I have my button props interface in my .tsx component, and then I'm going to extend the button attributes of the regular HTML button element. What this means is that this button component I'm creating will have access to all the props that are native to the button element, but it could still have all the functionality of whatever custom components I'm creating. So it's a really useful way of making sure that your components keep all the semantic attributes that they require from the semantic elements without you actually needing to use the semantic element. Hope that makes sense. And like putting a title on it, I feel like this usually applies to like small scale projects, because a lot of times when you're working with a large scale project or with a company scale project, they probably have some sort of content management system that handles all the SEO things like page titles and meta tags and everything. But sometimes you're working on building, let's say like a 5 components application, for example, and you may forget. But it's important to put titles on your pages, because that is what helps the screen reader, for example, differentiates between all the tabs that you have open in your little browser. So one way of putting a title is to use a React hook. You can just use effect, and basically once the page loads, it will assign document.title to whatever. So what I have here is a document.title constant from constant, and then I'm just adding the about page, for example. So this is one way you can do that. You can also use a framework. So you could use Helmet. Helmet's something really useful for helping you include your titles and your meta tags in your page. So there are different ways of handling it, and I'm sure people have like specific ways within their company that they do it. It's probably just something that you'd set up at the architectural stage, but it's also something that it's important to keep in mind. Another way this comes in handy is also for sometimes we end up having improper nesting of elements. Let's say you have a H1 tag somewhere, and then in another component you also have a H1 tag, but then by the time you nest the two components, you may end up breaking your little header components, because you may have like H1 and then you've broken the structure. So frameworks are also a really good way of handling that. You could use I think it's Helmet, but I cannot remember the name right now. There's also a framework that allows you, I'll look it up later and include it in the slides. There's also a framework that allows you to make sure that your components maintain their proper nesting of headings as you're importing them into each other. So that's great. And then using ARIA attributes to define custom elements. A lot of times we create custom elements and we forget about the attributes needed of those custom elements. You may think about things like, okay, sure, I've included an on-click property or an on-focus property or an on-blur property, but what about communicating the purpose of that element to the people who are using your site? So ARIA roles are really useful because they help you. So all these things I have here now are generic tabs, but because I've assigned them roles, to screen readers, they will no longer be generic, because now the screen reader can easily tell what this thing is meant to be for. So what I'm trying to create here is a simple tab component. So the first thing I have is my role tab list. This is going to tell the screen reader that this contains all the tabs that you'll be tabbing through, basically. I have my role tab as well. So this lets the screen reader know that, okay, this is one tab, and then this is another tab, and this is another tab. Then I have my tab panel where I'm displaying the content of the tab. So now, because in React, a lot of times the easy part about React is that you don't actually need to load all the data at once. You can just choose what you can conditionally render content based on, let's say, which tab has been clicked. So now it's important as well that you let your users know if content has been updated. An easy way to do this is to set the ARIA live property. I forgot to include that here, but there's an ARIA live property that updates screen readers whenever the content of a page is changed. So I could set ARIA live to off, or I could set it to polite, or I could set it to I can't remember. I always use polite, so I can't actually remember the other thing. But basically, it's a property that makes sure that your screen readers are always aware when content on a page has been updated. We use this because in React, a lot of times content relies on being updated. When you use things like component did mount or component did update, it's also important to think of, how am I communicating to my readers who can't easily see the page? How am I communicating to them that this component has been updated? And that's where the ARIA live property comes into play. So ARIA roles, ARIA lives, ARIA attributes, all these things are important. And then including keyword handlers. So now I've spoken a lot about custom components, but a lot of times when we're creating custom components, we don't really think of all the events that could be listed to that component. So the way I like to say it is, for every mouse event handler, there should be an equal and corresponding keyboard event handler. So what that means is, if a component can be clicked, can the function also be carried out if someone presses enter, for example? My puppy component here, and I have my function here that should run on click, and then I'm calling the function when it's clicked, but then also when the key is pressed on key down. What I'm doing here is basically detecting if a key has been pressed and which key has been pressed. So if the key that was pressed was the enter key, then if the key that was pressed was not the enter key, then it should just return a false function. If not, it should carry out the function that was defined down here. So it's really useful, because if we think back to that whole article about Parkwood Entertainment being sued, you will know that one of the things they listed there was not being able to navigate the site with a keyboard. So if someone cannot scroll through your site and be able to like press enter where they need to, and cannot be able to interact with the site just using a keyboard and not a mouse or not a touchpad, then your site is not accessible. Another thing is not forgetting to focus. So sometimes we have updates in our components, or we have updates in our page that may require somebody to focus on a particular thing. So think of it like, if you have a page and then a modal pops up. So a modal pops up, but now you have not updated the focus of your page. So somebody who is tapping through that page, they would have to tab through the entire page until they get to the point where the modal is. An easy way to do that is just to set the focus of any element that has been created. So one thing is sometimes we forget that not all elements are focusable by default. So if you're creating a custom component, most times if you're using a div element, it's not focusable. For example, div elements do not get focused. So let's say I'm creating a drop-down component here, and I'm using an unordered list, and I'm rendering each list item. Unordered list and list items are not focusable by default. So if I want to make sure that somebody who is using a keyboard is able to tab through my drop down component, I need to make sure that all the elements in my drop down components are able to be focused on. So an easy way to do that is just to, what I'm doing here is I have my is active state property and my set active action controller. And now click, I will just make sure that set active is active is set to true. And then once this list element, if its active is set to true, then the tab index should have a tab index of 0. A tab index of 0 basically means that this element can be focused on in the natural order that it appears on the page. So you can set tab indexes to 1s or to 2s. For example, this could be applicable to things that you want to make sure this element gets the first focus on the page. So maybe if you have like a modal that suddenly appears, or you have a skip to main content or skip to navigation button on your page, and you want to make sure that it gets the first focus on the page, then set the tab index to something high, like 1 or 2. But if you want to make sure your element just falls into the natural focusing order of the page, you could just set the tab index to 0. And that role we are including here is the aria hidden role. This is basically what communicates to screen readers that this thing is closed or this thing is open so you can read through it. And so it goes. And then we could also use the ref inputs in the ref key in React to pass inputs to a page. So for example, what this does is that once this component has been loaded, it will automatically set focus to this one. So I have my ref text input, and I've created a new ref instance of use ref none. And basically what I'm saying is for whichever element has this text input ref, set it to focus once it has been mounted. Hopefully that makes sense. So this is really useful for when you want something, let's say you have a contact page and you want to make sure that once the person gets to the page, they can focus on the first inputs in the form. Or if you have a search bar in the page and you want to make sure that people are able to search immediately they get to the page, you could also pass the focus to that. Yeah, and then setting focus to handle route changes as well. In React, a lot of times when a component is updated, it's not actually the entire page being reloaded, it is just the DOM element that is being refreshed. So a good way to handle route changes to make sure that the focus of the page is put on the part you want to focus on once the page has been updated, is also using your ref and using your use input. So once this page is loaded, it's going to focus on this input by default, and it's not going to still maintain the previous tab order from the previous page. Hopefully that makes sense. And then yeah, so that is about it for okay, great. I was trying to do this in 30 minutes, so I think we're still on time. That is about it for the tips we have. I also have some tools for testing accessibility, which I'll talk about briefly. The first is the light. Most of these tools are related to Chrome because I do work with Chrome a lot, but I am sure there are specific tools for Safari or Firefox, which you could also use for testing. So luckily, a lot of accessibility testing tools are not just for the browser you're working with. They are applied to all browsers and all screen readers and all forms of navigation that you could use. So the first I use is the Lighthouse tool. It is a tool in the Chrome DevTools tab. So basically, if you open Chrome DevTools, you can just see Lighthouse up there around where it says audits. You can audit it and generate a report for your site, and it will return you a score out of 100 on the things you did right in your site, and then it will tell you like things you can fix and things you can manually check. React Ally is a plugin for testing your React application's accessibility as you're writing the code. So it's really great. Chromevox is a screen reader tool I use in Chrome just to like hear what your page sounds like to people who are relying on screen readers. There's also the accessibility pane in Chrome, which is a really great way for seeing the accessibility outline of your page and knowing if your page is outlined in a way that's semantic for people who rely on that. And then another thing I forgot to mention here is the what is it? The Wave tool. Wave Wave, yes, it's the Wave, the Web Accessibility Evaluation Tool. It's a website where you can just go and enter the URL of your site, and then it shows you like if you've done the outlining right. It tells you if your nesting is correct, if you're missing any alt tags anywhere or anything. Another thing you can do is just manually tab through your site. Tab through your site, see if things are keyboard focusable, see if your drop downs work when people focus on them, see if your buttons are clicked, and see if your page tabs through in a normal context. So yeah. I also had a demo that I wanted us to go through because it would have been fun. So basically, it was just going to be a demo on testing these applications using these tools that I just mentioned. I also have some source code for the because I didn't really want to do live coding. I've learned my lesson and I said I would never live code again. So yeah, I have some source code in case you want to see like actual applications of accessibility practices in building components. And then this is the link to my slide. This is the old link, so I'll include the updated link. It's basically like if you go to my website, jemima.com/slides, you will see a link to all my slides there, and you can just find this one under building accessible React components. So yeah, I think we still have a bit of time. So yes, I also have the further reading links. So these are a bunch of articles I found online that I found really useful on creating accessible components or understanding the importance and the principles of accessibility in React, which we could definitely go through, and you guys could see it there. And that's about that for that. So I'm going to check if it's possible to switch my screens, and then I'll see if I can do the demo. But if not, I will. Once again, if you have any questions or any thoughts, or basically you just want to give me feedback, or you just want to talk about maybe like the kind of accessibility practice you use in your company, or you have any questions about relating to accessibility, you could ask them at the end of this chat, or if not, you could go to my website, jemimabu.com, and fill out the contact form there, or just hit me up on Twitter or LinkedIn at jemimabu, and I'd be glad to take your questions. So I'll just see if we have any questions now and then answer them.
Well, we're done, it seems. A little bit early, a little bit too fast, but now we can chat.
Well, I move fast.
So I don't know if we have any questions yet. Maybe they're gonna pop right now, or any insights or any feedbacks, as you asked. But I personally was interested more in the human aspect of you, in the nerd aspect of you, and in the. I know you like anime.
I do like anime.
Yeah, what's up with that? What anime do you like?
So what's up with that? Honestly, I have like I have fixed rules for the kind of anime I watch. One, it has to be funny. So if anybody dies at the beginning, or if there's anything dark, or so I don't watch the ones where like they are going to get revenge on their parents' killers or any of that. I stay away from the dark anime. It has to be funny. Better if it's slice of life or school. No romance. Do not deal well with anime romance, and hopefully 20 episodes or less, and like 20 minutes per episode.
Okay,
So
that's
that's
actually a very specific list of things you need for a good anime.
I'm very specific about anime. I always tell that to anybody who wants to recommend anything for me, it has to follow all those rules, or I'm just not.
Oh my god. Okay, what else? What else could tell us that you're a nerd?
Ah, you see, this is the problem. I always feel like I start putting that because then people are always trying to get me to prove it. They're like, "Yeah, you're a nerd. Name every single nerd culture there is," and I'm like, "No, I just meant I'm a nerd because like I watch anime and
And do code.
that's it. That's it. I watch anime and echo. Because like when I was growing up and you watch things like Dexter's Laboratory, like Dexter to me was like the proper example of a nerd, and that's all he did. He had this nerd videos and everything. Like he would watch Star Trek or like everything, and then he liked science stuff, and that was it for me, really.
Anyway, so if you want to say something to our audience, like the last words or something like that, so please do, or we just can say goodbye.
Last words. That sounds so morbid. Unfortunately, I have no snippets of wisdom. I have used all of it, and now I'm thinking about. I just got a bug alert from work, so I have to go sort that out. So thank you
Okay,
so
so it's a great thing you finished
much.
earlier.
Yeah, I actually had to speed it up. I was like, yeah, because I thought I would do this on my lunch break, and I forgot how time zones work. So my lunch break was actually 2 hours ago, not right now, which is great. Yeah, thank you all so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed the end of the conference. Hope you learned something, or at least you had fun. And yeah, that's about it for me. So